our next guest texted me last week as I was driving to Dallas because he had some A&M questions, and I never got back to him. And he still posted a video without my intel. What's up with Chris Phillips here from SEC Unfiltered? Chris, good morning, buddy. How are you?
David, good morning. Appreciate you having me on, man. Yeah, hey, listen, the opportunity's still there, man. We'd love to talk some Texas A&M football as we go into spring games, obviously coming up here in the next couple of weeks. But always a pleasure, man. I appreciate you having me on.
Hey, is that boxing gloves on your necklace? What is that? Give me.
No, it's a ring. So it's my grandfather's college ring. Yeah,
awesome,
so he and I were really, really close growing up. He passed in 2014, so I wear the college ring there. So
I love that, brother. That's great. Hey, so let's talk about. So yesterday I had a different question than you had. I was talking about, some unknowns for A&M football, but you have some questions for A&M football, and I thought maybe you could pose some of those questions to me, and I can give you what I think about it. I think one of them was about the culture. Am I right about that?
Yeah, so just the implementation of the culture. I mean, I think that's something anytime you got a first-year head coach, and I think the good news is, and where A&M's got that leg up, and I'm sure you would agree, is it's not like Mike Elko doesn't understand what Texas A&M's all about, right? He was there previously, so he gets, I think, the culture of the 12th man and what the expectations are. But I think anytime, obviously, it's a complete overhaul. I would say it feels night and day different from what Jimbo Fisher and company were doing, and that's no shot at Jimbo, but it just is a completely different vibe, which I think is going to be a net positive for A&M in the long run. But that was one of my questions, I think, or one of the questions I felt like Texas A&M needed to get answered this spring, which I'm sure they have, is just it's different verbiage, it's a different vibe, and I've been part of a team myself when you change over the head coaches or you change over the coaching staff, and there's going to be guys on your roster that are kind of mixed feelings, mixed emotions. They're on the fence, and it's about winning everyone over in the locker room and making sure everyone is bought in, because in the SEC, where it's so competitive and the margins are razor thin, you need everybody bought in to have success. So I think that's important, obviously, and I'm sure he's doing that again, just laying the foundation this spring.
Chris, what I'll say to that is a couple things. First off, any SEC team that wins 12 games in 2 years is going to have a bad culture. There's no SEC team that has a great culture that loses, right? That's just a fact. So nobody was complaining about the culture at A&M when they went to the Orange Bowl in 2020. And it's not like Jimbo Fisher forgot how to build a team. I think he lost a couple of his fastballs, no doubt about it, right? And the transfer portal and the entitlement that a lot of athletes have today has changed a lot of what we see. But losing breeds discontent in a locker room. So that's part of it. So I don't care if you're Nick Saban. If they won 12 games in 2 years, we'd be hearing very similar stuff about them. So that's A. B, the culture was really bad when they went 5-7. It was better at 7-5. There are things that were better. I do think that Mike Elko is addressing a lot of the deficiencies that A&M had head on. And like an example that Connor Wigman told Billy Lucci on this show, on this site a few months back, that like they're having position groups sit with other position groups at lunch, right? So you get to know everybody and have a different relationship. So until we see the wins and losses, we won't really know about the culture. And there are going to be some guys left over from the Jimbo era that probably just, it's too much for them. Tommy Moffitt comes in and is asking for X, Y, and Z. But I do think you have to hold people accountable, and those who don't want to be held accountable, see ya.
Yeah, David, it's, culture is one of those buzzwords in today's college football that, we talk about a lot. And it's one of those things where, like you mentioned, it's about wins and losses, right? So, that I feel like it only mainly comes up when things aren't going well, but you do have to have it, right? It's an essential piece. Like you mentioned, you're not going to have a bad culture and win a whole lot of games. But, in regards to on the field, man, the other things, which, we'll talk about at some point, but we can talk about today, is just, I was curious about the wide receiver room and the linebacker room. And I feel like A&M obviously finding replacements there. Certainly on the defensive side, when you lose Edrin Cooper, that's a big loss. I know Torian York is back, but outside of that, it's kind of like who emerges in that wide receiver when you lose Aniyah Smith and Evan Stewart. And I know, again, Texas A&M was one of the best in the transfer portal, picking up a number of impact guys, not just bodies, but impact guys. Troy transfer, La Tech transfer, some other dudes like Noah Thomas, Moose Muhammad that were big impact guys last year. That's who's going to take that next step. So, those were some of the questions that I had.
Sure.
But again, that's what spring ball is for, is to find those answers.
So I'll answer. I think a bigger question is cornerback. That's a huge question for me. They did attack the portal.
Secondary was rough in that bowl game.
Yeah.
That was
to watch. And again, they were down to like people who weren't playing, right?
Out.
But regardless, all season long it was rough, right? All season long, cornerback was a problem. Tyreek Chappelle comes back. They've hit the portal hard. But I have a bigger question about that. I like to see what Will Lee does, right? There's other players that I want to see what they can do. Ricks, I want to see what he turns into. So I have a bigger question there than I do at linebacker, although I do have the same question about linebacker because, yeah, you lose a guy like Edgerrin Cooper. What does that mean for that group? Torian York was phenomenal. And they picked up Scooby Williams. They picked up some others at linebacker that I think they're not going to be Edge Cooper, but they can make the group better. And by the way, I feel much better about the defense under Mike Elko than I did under DJ Durkin. And I like Durkin, but I think there was too much of shuffling going on there, especially with the defensive line with all the talent. One series would be these guys, the next series would be other. I don't think it'll be that kind of world for Coach Elko. To the wide receiver group, 100% valid question, right? You don't lose a guy like Aniyah Smith and get better. You just don't. As for Evan Stewart, you don't lose a talent like that and necessarily get better, but you look at what Ja'Day Walker did last year, and he basically had the same numbers as Evan. And there are certain players, and I think Evan was a very nice kid. I enjoyed my interactions with him. But when you play the social media game all the time about 1 foot in, 1 foot out, you know what? Fine, bro. I don't need you here. Like, you don't want to be here? That's fine. Go. If you're looking for interactions, this is not the place for you right now. In this rebuilding, that doesn't mean in college football you don't take those players because you take generational talent. But sometimes if generational talent is in 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and they don't produce the way a generational talent should, then you know what? Let's find out what we have. Cyrus Allen, Jabari Barber, these are names that I hope become household names for A&M, but it is a valid question. Can Noah Thomas stay healthy all season long? Moose Muhammad, when he plays amazing. There were reasons he didn't play, and some of it was personality conflicts with the coach and obviously some issues with other guys at the depth chart. But Moose Muhammad can be a game breaker and has been a game breaker. Let's see it consistently.
And David, to your point about Evan Stewart, it's one of those things too. Now we're in the NIL world, right? So if you're making an investment in a kid, you want his full buy-in. And when you don't have that, I mean, I don't blame anybody for saying, hey, no hard feelings, but we're better off going our separate ways. But, not related to spring, just the 2024 season. I think Texas A&M is actually one of the most fascinating teams in college football because year after year after year for so long, right? The hype that has surrounded the A&M program, it's far outweighed the production on the field. And this year, you look at it, I think Texas A&M is going to be set up really, really well to, I don't know if sneak up on people is the right word, because I think the roster is still very talented. But I mean, you look at the Vegas win total, over under 8.5 for a first-year head coach. That is significant. I think A&M's draw in 2024 is one of the most favorable, right? It's still difficult. It's the SEC, but in regards to favorability, it's one of the most favorable. And I just, David, my hope is this. I think Texas A&M folks should keep their expectations high. I know you'll do that. There's a standard in College Station, which I think is great. But I hope people allow Texas A&M to overachieve. Like, I think that's a great feel-good thing in year one. There doesn't need to be an immense amount of pressure or expectation or what have you. And I think the good news for A&M is most of the storylines going in this season are going to revolve around Alabama because it's Alabama and you got Kalen DeBoer there. But I think Texas A&M could be a really feel-good story in year one. I think they could win 9 games, maybe more. But let's just allow Texas A&M to overachieve. That's all I'm saying.
Well, let's take a look at the last 3 years. Bad teams find ways to lose games, right? And A&M found ways to lose games. But every one of these games, top team, very rarely did A&M get manhandled. I'll just look at last year's schedule alone. Some of the losses. The Miami loss was one of the more eye-popping games because that game was winnable, right? That game was absolutely winnable. But they lost on the road. They found a way to lose, and they've lost on the road for years, right? The other loss, the Alabama game. They were a possession away from winning that game. They were dominating at the half, or not dominating, but they were significantly doing what they had to do, right? Tennessee, they lost by 7 on the road. They couldn't do anything offensively at all in that game. They beat South Carolina. Ole Miss, they had a chance to win on the last, minute of the game. These are games that came down to the last play. And some of it was scheme. Some of it was just dumb mistakes. You clean up a little bit of that. These last couple years, Jimbo Fisher is still the head coach. By the way, a bulk of that talent is still here. Maybe not all that talent, but a bulk. And now you're playing the transfer portal game. They brought in guys, 30 dudes? Like, you bring in guys that will compete for starting jobs. So, I have none of us, like SEC Mike likes to throw hot sports takes. I don't have a hot sports take because I don't know. I got to see things. If they fix the offensive line, this team is a 9-10 win team. If they don't, we're right back to 8-4, 7-5. But I think they're trending in that direction to fix that offensive line.
Yeah, and I hope to see it too. And again, Texas A&M fans, I think, have been very patient. Obviously, there haven't been a double-digit win season since 2012, I believe, with Johnny Manziel. So I think it's coming with Mike Elko. I mean, I what he did at Duke, I think speaks alone. When you can go at a place like a Duke where you talk about having no expectations or really no standards, and a school that cares much, much more about round ball, I think, than football. What he did there was wildly impressive. So I think the culture change, the culture shift is going to pay off major dividends. And again, like you mentioned, man, I mean, even watching the bowl game, and I know not all of those guys are back, but one of my biggest takeaways was it's not like they're starting from scratch. Even with the guys you lost in the portal, like there's a lot of talent on the defensive line still. There's still going to be offensive playmakers. Obviously, Connor Wegman is back. He's going to be one of the most, I think, underhyped quarterbacks in the SEC. So as long as he stays healthy, man, I think Texas A&M, like you mentioned, I think 9-10 wins is certainly possible.
Is Connor Wegman a top 5 quarterback in the SEC if he stays healthy?
If he stays healthy, yeah, I do believe so. He was a guy that I looked at highly favorably last year. Obviously, the injuries derailed his season, but yes, if he is healthy, I think certainly you can make a major case for him being a top 5 quarterback. And I think he's got the talent, the upside to be a top 3 quarterback. But things have got to pan out, right? That takes some guys around him playing to their full potential. But no question in my mind he can be a top 5 quarterback.
What did you think a month ago with the Trev Alberts hire there for Texas A&M?
I thought it was a really good hire. I thought it was the right answer for Texas A&M. I feel like A&M, there were a couple different directions they could have gone, but I thought the Trev Alberts hire was solid. And I was impressed with it overall. I mean, I think it was what Texas A&M needed. So I thought overall it was a positive hire. And I know we actually did a segment on that. And basically everyone, I think, in our staff thought that was a positive hire as well. So I think it was a really good hire for A&M.
All right, your crystal ball today. Who are the top 2 teams in the SEC? Is it easy? Is it Georgia, Texas in your eyes? Or does it go a little bit deeper? Is Ole Miss the team?
It's funny. I was about to ask you, are we talking football or baseball? Because I think A&M on the diamond has got a say in that too.
Heck yeah, they do.
They got a big series this weekend actually in Columbia against South Carolina. But, I think it's really easy to say right now. And so you're asking me crystal ball when we're talking end of season or going into the season, who are the top 2 teams?
Going into the season. And then follow it up after the season.
Yeah, I think going in, it's hard not to say Georgia and Texas just because, Georgia is in there, no question. They're in that conversation. They're in the top 2 before and after the season, in my opinion. Texas is going to get the majority of the hype. And again, you guys know exactly what that's like, how much hype Texas gets on a year-in, year-out basis. It's been a lot of fun, by the way, not just interacting with you guys, but the Oklahoma folks as well, and how much they're like, hey, put a damper on that. We've heard that many years, and they never come through up until last year, right? So I think Texas going in, I'll say Georgia and Ole Miss end of season are the top 2 teams. Dude, if Ole Miss wins less than 10 games, it is a massively disappointing season for them. Like when you look at the talent they brought in, it might be the most talented defense they've ever had in school history. You got Lane Kiffin. We just dropped a segment this morning about Lane Kiffin talking about how it's a cheat code that they've got the communication with the quarterbacks and the helmets and stuff like that now for the first 25 seconds, the play clock. The embarrassment of riches they've got on the offensive side. The schedule sets up beautifully for them. If they don't win 11 games, I think a lot of people are going to look at that as a disappointment. So I'll go Georgia, Ole Miss at the end of the season as the top 2 standing.
My retort to Texas, look, I know they're good. Obviously, they made the college football playoffs, but I look at what they did last year in the Big 12. How many of those games should they have lost or could they have lost? Now, I use that same logic for A&M games that they should have won, but you look at the Houston game, you know how that game ended, right? That Houston could have easily won that game, and some people think they were robbed. The K-State game went into overtime. That's another loss. Iowa State had their chances at the end. TCU had their chances at the end. This ain't the Big 12, brother, right? Like, of the SEC schedule you could pick, I think it's a very nice one for Texas, no doubt about it. Because you get Georgia at home, you get Michigan rebuilding, right? So there are definitely things that are pointing in it being an easier season. But if you look at Sark's totality as a head coach and really at his time at Texas, this year could prove a lot in his legacy because you should have won a national championship or been to more playoffs in the Big 12 because now it's going to get hard.
My question to you, David, is this. I'll respond to your question with a question. How much goodwill would Mike Elko build? I know it's just not all about beating your rival, but if you end the season beating Texas, I feel like that's a pretty good way to start your tenure off in College Station.
Sure. I mean, that week, it'll be the most important thing in the world for all of us, right? I'm concerned about making the playoffs. I'm concerned about blocking and keeping our quarterback healthy for the first time in 3 years. And if that means if A&M is playing at a playoff level come that game against Texas, oh yeah, I mean, the atmosphere is going to be crazy anyway. But if A&M and Texas are both battling it out for one of those spots, yeah. And to me that means everything is clicking for A&M, which would mean A&M is winning that game in that scenario. But there's a long way to go before that.
Yeah, I can't wait to see that rivalry play out, man. I mean, I've heard about it for quite a long time. It's, I guess, what was the last time they played on the football field? Was it 2000, early 2010s, right? Was
2011 season.
2011 season, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been quite a while. And I remember watching those games and just the nastiness and the energy and the emotion. Obviously, we've seen it on the diamond play out, and that's always a lot of fun. But yeah, to see that rivalry renewed, man, it's been going far too long. And I mean, like you mentioned, man, with Texas, I mean, who knows, man? First year in the SEC, I know they don't like to hear it, right? Both Texas and Oklahoma, and I know the expectations are much more conservative for OU. But I mean, you know, I reminded people a couple weeks ago that Oklahoma beat Texas last year. So, like, who knows? You know what I mean? And in the SEC, the difference is from the Big 12 to the SEC, if you lose to Oklahoma one week, like next week you got LSU, you got A&M, you got Florida, you got Georgia, you got Ole Miss. Like, there are literally no weeks off. And I think the thing that separates it, too, is when you play these middle-of-the-pack teams or even lower-level teams, there truly are no Saturdays off. So it's going to be very interesting to see how both Texas and OU handle life in the SEC in year one.
Who's got the biggest boom or bust potential this year in the SEC?
That's a good question, David. I lean the Auburn Tigers. I do. I think Auburn is primed to take a major step forward. You know, you could label Texas A&M, I guess, but I don't think it would be fair to label anything in Mike Elko's first year as a bust just because there's so many new moving pieces right in a year one. Again, the culture shift and terminology and verbiage and brand new coaching staff, et cetera. So I'll go Auburn in year two with Hugh Freeze. I mean, I think you look at them last year, right? They were another team that was really, really close. Could have beaten Georgia. Probably should have beaten Alabama. They also experienced the lowest of the lows, that New Mexico State game and that ugly bowl game against Maryland. So, you know, I'm not a huge believer in Peyton Thorne at the quarterback position admittedly, but Hugh Freeze takes over play calling. If he can get the best out of him, I think Auburn could be a sneaky team to win 8 or 9 games.
Am I alone in thinking, I just am not buying LSU as much as a lot of other people are? And look, here are the reasons why I could buy them. Because the years that I haven't bought them, they seem to do amazing things, right? But no Jaden Daniels. The defense, maybe it's better. It can't be worse. But you lose 3 first-round picks on the offense potentially. Like, how can you – and they were, 9-3 last year before the bowl game, right? So how can you be better without 3 NFL pros? Maybe they are. Maybe, you know, they fix the defense and it changes everything. But I'm having a hard time seeing them being better.
It's kind of like you said, David, when talking about like a guy like Aniyah Smith. Like, you don't lose a guy like that and your wide receiver room necessarily gets better, at least in the short term. You don't lose your Heisman Trophy winning quarterback and get better offensively. Like, as good as Garrett Nussmeier, I think, could be, he was great in that bowl game against Wisconsin, obviously leading them late and winning that ball game. Garrett Nussmeier has been very, very inconsistent throughout his tenure. Like you mentioned, it's not just him. You lose Malik Neighbors too. So they've got talent on the offensive side, but I think they're going to have to win games differently. Like, I think they're still going to be able to score. Don't get me wrong. They got a veteran offensive line, which is a great place to start. They got a lot of young talent in the running back room. But that defense, that defense was historically bad. And they got to take a couple steps forward this year. I thought the hiring of Blake Baker at DC was a fantastic hire. I think they're going to utilize Harold Perkins in a much better way. I think he's going to get back to that 2022 form that saw him be arguably the best defensive player in the SEC that year. But, to your point, man, you lose all that talent. How are you going to take a step forward and get better? I still think LSU is going to be one of those teams right on the edge of 9 or 10 wins, fighting for a college football playoff spot. But to your point, David, again, you lose as much as they did. They're going to have to win games different ways. And if that defense doesn't take the steps forward they're hoping, it could be a year of regression for Brian Kelly.
I don't have Oklahoma's schedule in front of me, but I just want to finish with them. I looked at Texas's schedule, and you see the Georgia and the Michigan games. You're like, oh, eyebrow. But then you also see Vandy and some of the other games that they have. Like, all right, not too bad of an SEC schedule considering. Oklahoma, when I looked at it couple weeks back, that I'm worried about them in a good way. Like, I don't mind. Like, but what do you see with Oklahoma this year?
Yeah, they got a brutal schedule. I mean, like you mentioned, it starts early. They got Houston in non-conference play. Tulane is a sneaky game you can't sleep on, and obviously open up SEC play against Tennessee. When it comes to Oklahoma, I'm a little nervous for them, admittedly. They have question marks, David, and you know this, right? They have question marks where you cannot afford to have question marks in the SEC. That's at quarterback and the offensive line. And I think Jackson Arnold, you watch the bowl game, a lot of the mistakes he made were correctable, and I think you saw the upside as well and the potential. And I think he could be, one of those guys. He's got the potential to be a top half of the SEC quarterback, but he has no experience in the conference. And again, the offensive line is what I really worry about. You lost so much there. It's kind of a patchwork group at this point, at least. And I think this is a big year for Brent Venables' defense, right? Like when you hire a guy and it's like they have a calling card one way or another. You need to at least see that side of the ball pan out. I thought it was much, much better last year, but year one was rough. The defense needs to take another step. And again, the schedule is brutal. I mean, you got to go to Auburn. You got to go to Ole Miss. You got to go to Mizzou. You got to go to LSU. You got Bama mixed in there as well. So it's a brutal schedule. So, I mean, I think this could be a 7-5 team. I know Oklahoma fans don't want to hear that. The over-under win total in Vegas is 6.5, and I think it's that number for a reason because the schedule really start to finish, right? When you break down this schedule, wins, toss-ups, and losses, there's a lot of toss-ups on this schedule. There's not a lot of games you look at and check off and say that's an automatic win. So when it comes to Texas and Oklahoma coming in the league year one, who I'm more worried about, certainly it's Oklahoma. But I mean, if the offensive line pans out, I definitely think Jackson Arnold's a guy that has the potential and the upside to make that thing go. And if that defense takes a step forward, they could certainly make some noise in the SEC year one. But I could see it being a year of growing pain, no doubt, for them.
Chris, great stuff, man. Thanks so much.
David, appreciate you, man. Always a pleasure.
Appreciate you. Yeah, Chris Phillips there, SEC Unfiltered. Check out his YouTube channel. Does great work out there.